Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now in Vancouver, we have a beautiful afternoon at 1:09 p.m. Thank you so much for joining for today's online program with Souvankham Thammavongsa at Center A. And my name is Henry Hung Liu. I'm the Executive Director and Curator of Center A, Vancouver International Center for Contemporary Asian Art. And before we begin, I would like to, on behalf of Center A, acknowledge that we are situated on the unceded and ancestral territories of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples on which we create, learn, and live. And we have the honor to gather today. Unceded means that this land was never surrendered, relinquished, or handed over in any way. We recognize that the indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed from the homelands and territories upon which an institution was built and currently occupies in. To acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize the city and country's longer history predating Confederation, one where indigenous peoples have lived since time immemorial. I will also acknowledge that the water it's featured in our current exhibition with PN tracing water is from Capilano, Seymour, and Coquitlam watersheds. We encourage you to reflect on the history on the land and you are watching or streaming this program from, and also the land's caretakers and stewards. Located in Vancouver's Chinatown, Center A also acknowledges and recognizes the complex and multi-layered experiences of the individuals and communities who have lived, built, and contributed to the vibrancy of this historic neighborhood, and those who continue to do so today. Center A is the only public art gallery in Canada dedicated to contemporary Asian and Asian diasporic perspectives since 1999. We are committed to providing a platform for engaging diverse communities through public access to the arts, creating mentorship opportunities for emerging artists, writers, and arts professionals, and stimulating critical dialogue through exhibitions and public programs that complicate understandings of migrant experiences in diasporic communities. And today's program with Souvankham, it's part of our 2022 speaker series in conjunction with our the first edition of our arts writing mentorship program at Center A. And over the course of 12 weeks, it was such a pleasure to host 8 young writers of Asian descent who were at different stages of their careers. And we had weekly sessions with the primary mentors, Ellen Cho and Bo Pache, and also weekly guest lectures, studio visits, and gallery visits. And today's program is what we like to conclude the speaker series with this year with Souvankham. And it's such an honor to have her here today with us to talk about her book, How to Pronounce Knife, and also hear the reading of some of the excerpts of the book. And I would like to quickly introduce Souvankham. So Souvankham Thammavongsa is the author of 4 poetry books and a short story collection, How to Pronounce Knife, winner of the 2020 Scotiabank Giller Prize and 2021 Trillium Book Award, finalist for the National Book Critique Circle Award and Pan America Open Book Award, out now with Little Brown and McClelland Stewart and Bloomsbury, available in French with foreign rights sold in China, Korea, Poland, and Turkey. Her stories have won an O. Henry Award and appear in the New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, the Paris Review, the Atlantic, Granta, and Noon. She has also written book reviews for the New York Times and edited Anthologies, Best Canadian Poetry in 2021 and the Griffin Poetry Prize in 2021. She's known for her PowerPoint videos on Zoom about writing, most recently one titled I'm Not That Interesting. Currently, she's working on her first novel. She was born in the Lao refugee camp in Nong Khai and was raised and educated at public schools in Toronto. So I feel like I've spoken enough, and I also want to quickly acknowledge the support of the Canada Council and also the BC Arts Council for the realization of today's program. And also, so I will, before I give the mic to Souvankham, I would like to also quickly introduce, to mention that we will have a conversation between Souvankham and Century's library assistant, Coco Zhou, and stay tuned. Okay, without further ado, hi everyone, Souvankham, so great to see you and love your Zoom background, and I will disappear for now.
Thank you so much for having me here this afternoon. I'm going to talk briefly about my story collection, How to Pronounce Knife, in particular, where these stories come from. And I'm going to read a few passages, and then I'm going to open it up to a Q&A. Don't be shy and have some questions ready for me. As a writer, I've always followed my joy. All my poems, all my writing is about where I come from, where I live, what I have. I've been writing about that for a long time. I wrote about trees, snow, the rain, a snail, a grasshopper, my gaze. I've always taken a single word and paid attention to it. My stories come from my poetry, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my poetry. The word small in my first book, Small Arguments, is not seen in its usual meanings. The word small is usually seen as being insignificant, invisible, less. I've always seen that a single word, a single letter, the shape it makes and takes up on a page can do more than what it means. My second book is called Found. My father kept a scrapbook when we lived in a refugee camp, and when he threw this book out, I took it from the garbage and I read it. Found is a book about reading the act of reading. I wanted to control what a reader saw, how a reader pays attention, what a reader was drawn to, what they lingered on, what they couldn't ask, and to live with that. I built my book in the presence of a thing a reader cannot ever see. It's about a mind and what it can build given the fewest possible resources. And this book, Found, is also a story of the refugee. I was in Marfa, Texas, when I stood in a room of 100 mil aluminum boxes. It was a sculpture by Donald Judd. Each of the 100 works had the same outer dimension, but the interior is unique in every piece. Every box had its own work, and together they made a work. I wanted to take a single word, one we've all seen and heard before, and work with that. The word I wanted to work with was light. Its many meanings, visual, natural, organic, artificial, accidental, light in touch, in tone, in scale, in taste, in feeling, in languages other than English. The word then was made particular and personal to me. There are many ways to tell a story. Sometimes you can build it with just one word. And in my fourth book, Cluster, it's about the shape of a circle that at any given time, you can make a circle anywhere. You just have to decide where that is. As many of you know, How to Pronounce Knife is not my first book. I've been writing for over 25 years. Writing is a field where you can do good work, meaningful work, and your colleagues and the people who should know sometimes haven't heard about you, but you do the work anyway. I thought I might say a bit about my family and where I come from, because behind this book, How to Pronounce Knife, is a person. My family and I were one of 3 million people nobody in the world wanted. My father built a raft made of bamboo to get to the Mekong River to a refugee camp in Nong Khai, Thailand. I was born there. It's usually the case that the country you're born is the country you come from. But in my case, the country I was born in considers me a stateless person, a person without a country. I'm uncomfortable belonging to anything. In fact, I don't want to belong. And I think it's strange to want to belong. This shows up in my story collection. My story collection deals with belonging, but the theme of belonging is handled differently. It's not something to want. Writers usually have an audience waiting. When women of color write short story collections, publishers now say, for fans of Souvankham Thammavongsa. When I wrote How to Pronounce Knife, I was not allowed to say that because I actually had to be Souvankham Thammavongsa. If you're a writer and you're original and distinct, publishing has a hard time explaining what you are and what you're doing with your work. As a writer, I'm considered a risk. I have no Twitter followers, no MFA, and no PhD. I don't treat immigrants and refugees as sad, quiet lumps in the world. They are ferocious, funny, determined. My characters are proud to be Asian. Not knowing the English language is not embarrassing or humiliating or shameful. It's just a fact. There are certainly sad moments, but that's not all there is in this story collection. And if it is sad, the triumph is that every single person in the story is trying. And to demonstrate, I want readers to hear the tone of this story collection. One thing I've been noticing is that readers inherit the tone of these kinds of stories, and they assume my stories are sad until they hear me read from them. How to Pronounce Knife. The child does not tell him the K in knife is silent. She doesn't tell him about being in the principal's office, about being told of rules and how things are the way that they are. It was just a letter, she was told, but that single letter out there alone and in the front was why she was in the office in the first place. She doesn't tell how she insisted the letter K was not silent. It couldn't be, and she had argued and argued. It's in the front, the first one. It should have a sound. And then she screamed as if they had taken some important thing away. She never gave up on what her father said on that first sound there. And none of them, with all their lifetimes of reading and good education, could explain it. As she watches her father eat dinner, she thinks of what else he doesn't know, what else she would have to find out for herself. She wants to tell her father that some letters, even though they're there, we do not say them. But she decides now is not the time to say such a thing. Instead, she tells her father only that she has won something. When she shows her father the prize, he is delighted because in some way he has won it too. They take the prize, all the little pieces of it, and start forming the edge, the blue sky, the other pieces, the middle, the whole picture. They fill those in later. Paris. Women like Nicole are who the romantic movies were made for. They are always the star of their own lives, and they always got their man in the end. But beauty, for all it could get you, and all that fussing it took to get it, seems so awful a burden to have to carry and maintain. There was so much to lose. In that moment, Red felt grateful for what she was to others, ugly. It's one thing to be ugly and not know it. It's another to know. That public declaration of love in front of family and friends, like Nicole and Tommy had, Red knew it wasn't something that would ever happen for her. It didn't matter what Tommy did outside of that promise. It had been made, and he would always come back to it sooner or later. The only love Red knew was that simple, uncomplicated, lonely love one feels for oneself in the quiet moments of the day. It was there, steady and solid in the laughter and talk of the television, and with her in the grocery aisles on the weekends. It was there every night in the dark, spectacular and sprawling in the quiet, and it all belonged to her. I don't usually read from this story, Slingshot. Actually, I've never read it in a public setting. But this afternoon, this is going to be my first time reading Slingshot. Slingshot. For the rest of the morning, we played board games and charades. Eve and Richard had a way of talking with each other that made it difficult to join in. They made references and jokes and told stories about each other in bits and pieces that never came together because they'd break out in laughter. They never bothered to explain what any of this was about, always saying we would have to have been there to get it. I had been around. I knew what was happening. Richard was oblivious to what Eve was doing with him, playing the two men off of each other. I got up and went out to the front porch. It was only 3 in the afternoon. I thought of going home, and then Daniel came out for a smoke. He lit his cigarette, and we watched the trees around us. The leaves were far apart, and they waved, darted left and right. Pushed by the wind, they looked like a school of fish in the blue sky, a thing out of place. We did not know what to say to each other. We were there at the same time, wanting the same thing, but from different people. If there were anyone else who understood what it was like to be on the outside, looking in on those two, it was Daniel. After a while, he said to me, "You ever seen a tornado before?" I told him I hadn't. He nodded and went on. They destroy everything. You can see it coming in the distance. Most people would try to get the hell out of there. Some people see it coming and can't help. but watch. I didn't say anything, and then he winked at me. Mani Petty. Raymond's sister had him practice on a plastic hand. Thing was, it wasn't attached to anything. It was severed at the wrist and stood straight up in the air like it was waiting to give you a high five. The plastic hand could be moved around for a better angle to paint a heart or put on dots. His sister watched him without saying a word. When he was done, she picked up the plastic hand and waved it around in his face and said, "But hands come with fucking bodies. You can't be turning a client's hand 360 degrees to draw a heart. And is that what it's supposed to be, Raymond? A fucking heart? Looks to me like a stinking blob of disgusting shit." She plopped the plastic hand down onto the empty station behind her, clearing Raymond's small surface area for him, and then held out her own hands. "Here," she said, "try on me." For someone who did manicures all the time for other people, his sister sure didn't have the best nails. They were long and yellowed at the tips, and her skin was dry and flaking. "Watch your face. I know what you're thinking about these nails. If I paint them, the polish remover I use on clients will just screw them up. And I can't, and I ain't going to be using that gel stuff on myself. It's expensive." He had started to cut her nails when she added, "Talk to me like I'm a client. Go on. Ask about my day, the weather. Say something nice about me. Try to make conversation." Raymond tried to think of what he could say, but before he could open his mouth, his sister reassured him, "Don't worry too much about this part. Most of the time, they won't talk to you because they think you don't know how to speak English, which is fine because it's exhausting to make conversation. I don't care about their kids or husbands or boyfriends or whatever they're doing this weekend. If you don't want to talk to a client because you're tired or not interested, just turn to me and speak loud. They'll think we're talking about them, and that'll just shut them up." For cheap nails, Raymond thought he had to do and remember so much. Chickachee. At school, the next day, my brother and I took our candies at lunch and displayed them on a table like we were street vendors telling our friends we went chickachee where the houses were gigantic. Our friends kept to their buildings or to the houses next doors or hadn't gone out at all. So they only had little gumballs or one or two tiny chocolate bars. We had bags and bags of chips, whole chocolate bars and packs of gum. And there was more waiting for us at home. The lunch woman on duty leaned through the crowd around us and said, "Don't you mean you went trick-or-treating?" We shook our heads. The woman did not know what she was talking about. I looked up at her big, round, intrusive face and said, "No, Mrs. Furman, we went chickachee." Edge of the world. My parents went to these parties to hear the news from back home or to ask what happened to those they left behind. Who was still there? Was their house still standing? And if they made it out of Laos, which refugee camp did they end up in? How long were they there? And where did they land? When my parents read the newspaper or watched the evening news, they never heard anything about what was happening in their country. It was almost as if it didn't exist. My father was often at the center of these parties. A wave of laughter would crash in from the living room, and when I peered inside, he would be there telling everyone his stories. The one everyone seemed to love to hear him tell was the yes, sir story. And even though they had all heard it before, he would begin the story as if they hadn't. He told them how he said, yes, sir, in English at work, whenever anyone told him what to do, but he said it with the tone and force of a fuck you. Then he marched around the room and saluted everyone like a dutiful soldier, saying in English, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, each time. He cackled with glee at how the people at work thought he was so polite and nice. My mother watched and listened to all of this from the kitchen, but she never joined. She kept to herself at these parties, eating a plate of food surrounded by Tupperware, glass casserole dishes, steaming pots, simmering pans, plastic forks and spoons. I stayed there with her, and she told me what each dish was and how it was supposed to be cooked. She pointed out that some of the key ingredients were missing and that none of the dishes could live up to her memory of the real thing. She said the food in Laos just tasted better and that maybe someday when I was older, we could go back and visit. She said all of this to me in Lao. A woman in the kitchen overheard her and said, your child understands Lao? My mother was proud that I could still have something from the old country, even though I had never been there. But the woman said to her, oh no, you better start speaking English with her. How's she going to fit in once she gets to school? When the woman left the kitchen, we laughed at her, how worried sick she seemed about not fitting in with everybody, as if that's a thing to want. One more passage. It's from the story A Far Distant Thing. One time during my father's break, he had told me at work that a man who worked on the line with him said something about the way he worked, mimicking his speed, scooping up everything around him. Dad thought it was a compliment, so he pretended to pick things up too, agreeing that was the way to work. He was happy someone at the factory was talking to him instead of pulling at the skin on the side of their eyes and laughing as he walked by. It wasn't until the foreman laid off a few more workers who couldn't keep pace that they started to come up to him and say a word to his face that sounded like spitting. It took so much air to make that word, but the spit never arrived. He asked me what they were calling him at the factory, this thief thing. What is it? I didn't want to tell him. I wanted him to go on liking his job, to get up in the morning with a sense of purpose and pride like he did. I told him, I never heard of this word before. Then I turned away so I wouldn't have to look at his face as he told me, see, all you have to do is work hard. That's all it is, hard work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Souvankham, for taking us through your personal history and your family history, and for those gorgeous performances, for sharing those excerpts with us. So I think we're going to jump right into our Q&A period. I want to remind our audience to please send in your questions via the Q&A box. And we've prepared some questions for you, so I will read from those. And I think we're going to start with this question about names. So Audre Lorde writes that her poetry is to give name to the nameless so that it can be thought. Names have an important role in your stories, whether it is the characters' names or lack thereof, or the act of naming something like Chickachee or knife with a hard K. Playing with names seems to allow you to gesture toward alternate ways of knowing. So what does your writing give name to and makes available for thinking?
I think my writing addresses the thing underneath the name. Like never once do I use words like racism, even though it's very clear what's happening on the page is exactly that. And never once do I use a word like privilege, even though what's happening on the page is exactly that. I think readers understand and know that, and I don't have to put that on the page. It's certainly a challenge for myself not to name a character. I think it's fun to make a character and not name them, and yet somehow make them so incredibly memorable that you can't believe that that person is made up, that when you go to the nail salon, you're absolutely sure that the person who's working on your nails could actually be the sister in Mani Petty, even though she might wear a name tag like Susan. Whereas I feel like if I named a person in a story, sometimes a name can get in the way of what I've made. For example, the name Susan. It's a common name, and if I use that name, everyone has their own encounter with someone who carries that name. And when we hear that name, they may think of their own experience of their Susan and not the Susan that I've made. So oftentimes I tend not to name my characters. If we think of like our parents, for example, we don't name them. We call them like mother, father. And sometimes when we describe some of the people we love the most, we describe our relationship to them, like brother, sister, cousin, aunt.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I want to ask a question about Slingshot, which you read from. And you actually have another story in the book, The Gas Station, which I think tackles a very similar theme. So in both these stories, you set up these adult relationships that kind of subvert the expectations of heterosexual romance, with the female characters taking on a more dominant position. And these are also women who tend to be overlooked. So for instance, Slingshot features a 70-year-old protagonist, and the protagonist from the gas station considers herself the kind of person who remains unseen. And you're right, and I take this as a sort of thesis from these two stories. Quote, what was the difference between someone who lied about love and someone who didn't love you? Nothing. So I guess I'm wondering what you were trying to get at with these two stories. What is it about these characters that give them insight into this nothing?
I think it goes back to the earlier question about naming. When we use a word love, it's a naming of an act or a naming of it. And sometimes we name things, but they're not, just because we have a word for it doesn't necessarily mean that there's meaning behind it. In those two stories, especially, well, the inspiration was for Slingshot was actually I wanted to see at the center of a love story an old woman. I think whenever we see women falling in love in rom-coms, they tend to be young and stupid. And somehow they get to be the main character, the leading lady. And I just thought, why can't we put an old woman, a 70-year-old woman, and make her wisdom sexy? And why can't what happens in these two stories, The Gas Station and Slingshot, is that they are love stories, but they, in the structure of a love story, you end up with your love interest. But what happens in these two stories is that's unusual is that they do not choose their love interest. There is a love interest, but they do not end up with their love interest. And that in itself, the decision to be alone can feel romantic, can feel profound and meaningful. And that's what happens in these two love stories, that you can have a love story and you don't have to end up with your love interest. You can, in the end, be alone, and that in itself is enough and powerful as the act, and is an act of love.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think the next question I want to ask is kind of concerning the context of when the book is published. So How to Pronounce Knife was published in April 2020, just a couple months before the summer of, quote, racial reckoning, consisting of mass protests against anti-Black police brutality and the rise of anti-Asian racism. I'm wondering how you think this cultural moment has perhaps affected how your book has been received, and how you position this work in relation to the, I guess, canon of Asian American or Canadian literature that has since emerged.
I think at that time, it opened space for writing to be diverse. Like if, for example, as someone from whose family is from Laos, it's often the case that when we hear stories of immigrants and refugees, they're often incredibly sad, and rightly so, but that's all that we get to see. But in real life, there's a diversity of experiences, not just as human beings, but within other Asian communities. So I think like my stories, when they came out, it really resonated with readers because it opened space for a different tone, and that tone was easily read. Often as writers of color, we're often to only write about trauma, or even when we're trying to be funny, we're often asked, where's the trauma? As I have been asked by a book club before, because they were expecting me to, write about people arriving on a boat, or, arriving, in rags, and or longing and crying for home. But instead, these stories didn't do that. They were, in fact, many readers were actually asking, why are these stories so ordinary? But that time really opened up a space to say that you can have a story and be ordinary, and that can be profound. We rarely get to see ourselves just trying to live to get to the next day, to want things like a job, love, a family. And these stories did that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what you just said about taking the ordinary to the profound is very much, I feel like, the essence of poetry as well. And I think my final question for now will be actually not on a list, but just came to me, which is, you were talking about, I think reading your stories, I get the sense that you are the type of writer who likes to make their reader work a little. And for instance, there's a sense in which you're kind of just dropped into the story, right? You're not really giving any, as you said, sometimes you don't name your characters. Oftentimes, you don't name the place the story is happening. There's a sense of unmooring that's happening for the reader. And I think we're also kind of, there's certain, I guess, yeah, I think there's a certain level of vulnerability and risk that the reader is expected to engage in. And so I wonder, what were your thoughts on with that?
Right. I don't give my readers any bearings. I don't explain what a refugee is. I don't give a cultural tour of Laos. I don't give a historical description of why people in Laos were refugees or why they had to come to North America. And I think that makes a reader, whatever background you have, whether you are from Laos or you're not, whether you don't know what it's like to work in a chicken processing plant or a nail salon, in that moment, you're unmoored. Because I don't give you your bearings, we all arrive at the same place, and the reader, whatever their background is displaced, not the people in the text, not the story. It's the reader that's displaced, and it doesn't matter what they know or where they're from. In that moment, they don't know anything.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, so we actually have one question in the Q&A box.
So shy.
Yeah, a little quiet audience. So yeah, this question from Primrose. I was wondering how the character's relation to hope and at times the rejection of hope plays an important role in the stories.
Well, in Mani Petty, Raymond, the narrator talks about the idea of hope is that you only have hope when the thing you want isn't there. I know the idea of hope can be lovely, but I feel it's an imagined thing. I rather just take what I have and live with that, not hope and long for something that may be impossible or that may never arrive. I don't like that feeling of longing. So if I don't have something, then I can let it go and live in its absence. I don't want to spend a single minute, hoping for something that obviously isn't there.
Thank you. That's super fascinating. I think it makes me think about how hope becomes politicized, right? And even just kind of the culture of aspiration that, for example, advertising has perpetuated. And I guess relatedly, I have a question here about class and how class is portrayed through your stories. So in Many Pity, Paris, and Picking Worms, for instance, you present instances where class conflict is dramatized within the workplace or family or through the spectrum of romance. And they also describe conditions of low-wage labor, which are often obscured. Wondering what is at stake for you in these representations of class relations?
Often when we have discussions about class, they often take place in environments like, or in circles where, like education or the business world, where people who are in those areas tend to do well. And in a field where you're picking worms, or plucking feathers, those same concerns about promotion, wanting to get to the next level, doing a good job, are the same concerns. But also something I wanted to point out with these jobs is they're incredibly difficult. Often people, or generally these jobs, like doing nails, they're kind of looked down upon. But actually, I wanted to take readers into a world where it is as difficult as brain surgery. You know, the kind of clients you get, at least with brain surgery, the client on the table there gets it. What you're, are paid, you're paid well to do that. And they respect what you do. Whereas if you're picking worms, doing someone's nails, your clients aren't always the kindest. But if you look at the detail of the job, it requires tremendous skill, a devotion, a faith, a commitment like any other job. And I really wanted to point that out, and to engage in conversations about work and why, and to respect workers who are doing that job. It's the grunt work of the world. Such work deserves to be at the center of a story.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we're just a couple minutes before we have time. You still have time to get your questions in. And I guess I wonder if you've heard about how the book has been received in different countries, if that's something you've, heard.
It just came out in Poland. And I don't know what the readers think yet because it's too soon. But for myself, just seeing the writing in another language is so lovely. And it made me think of How to Pronounce Knife and what I did with the English language. I made the English language feel foreign, but within the English language. I didn't know that until I read it in French, or I looked at the Polish language, where when you have distance from the English language, you do see its strangeness. You do see, and it's a lot more biting in another language when you say like, why is there a letter right there and nobody says anything? When you see it in the French language or the Polish language, because you're so far removed from the English language, you see that it is strange, but to have done it in the English language, and to call attention to its strangeness within the English language, I think was something I didn't intend or notice until I saw it in other languages.
Thank you so much, Souvankham. This is just incredible, and then so great to hear kind of dissect the parts of the book a little bit, and then to hear you reading about the some of the stories, and really fantastic. And I guess, well, if people still have one questions, I think we could probably take it if you want to put in a Q&A, but I do have one last question, because we have some of our arts writing mentees and mentors actually in the audience. And then this program is presented in conjunction with the arts writing mentorship. So I was wondering if you might have some advice for our mentees, our young writers, and especially sustain like a career, and you've been writing for over 20 years, and then it's sometimes I think that people come and go, and then so perhaps if you could share some advice for our
well, writing is very precarious. You can be very, yes, I have been writing for more than 20 years. And when I started, there were many writers who were far more talented than me, who were mentored and, uplifted, and they've disappeared. And part of that, I don't know why. It's very hard. What's important is, I think, is to care. No one can teach you how to care. And if you care, if you show up and keep working, the work survives. And I think you as a writer will continue to be around. It's hard, it's difficult, I have trouble with the idea of mentorship. I think as a writer, you should work alone, and you shouldn't have someone tell you you're a writer. You should figure it out, what it means to be a writer, and define that by your own terms. Like for me, I just wanted to write, to put pen to paper, to have books. And I've never lost that.
Thank you so much. And so we are coming to the end of the program. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And also to Souvankham for this amazing talk and reading, and thanks Coco for moderating the Q&A. And if you haven't, for folks in the audience, if you haven't read the book, How to Pronounce Life, and today it would be a great start to do that. And I really appreciate the book, because I do find that there's a lot of agency in the characters. And also I completely agree on the part that, where a person is perceived, they don't always have to write about what they are expected to write. And then I really like that there is this distance, but also very effortless kind of distance from kind of being typecast into writing certain kind of stories about belonging or trauma all the time. So really refreshing read, and really appreciate it. And I hope he win more awards. So yeah, thank you for this very important publication. All right, thank you so much, everyone. And if you'd like to stay in loop about Century's upcoming programming, please subscribe to our newsletters, and then it's at century.org/subscribe. Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend.